18 years ago, Daniel Reyes was nothing more than a broke widower with an ordinary toolbox and an extraordinary heart when he found a barefoot girl asleep on the platform of a shuttered train station and decided, without asking anyone's permission, that she would not spend one more night alone. He gave her his last name, gave her a room of her own, and gave her proof that the world still made room for kindness. 18 years later, that same man stood in a federal courtroom, accused of stealing from the company he built with his own hands, and told he had 72 hours before he lost it all. But when the courtroom doors opened on the final morning, a girl from that platform walked in wearing a prosecutor's badge of a different kind, a bar license, and a folder that would burn the whole conspiracy to the ground. If you love stories about quiet loyalty and impossible reversals, stay with us, because this one earns it. The night it started, Portland was drowning under a February rain that came sideways off the river. Daniel Reyes had just clocked out of a 16-hour shift at the shipping yard. Diesel and rust worked so deep into his hands that no amount of soap ever fully lifted it. He was 32 that winter, a father raising a son alone since his wife's death 2 years earlier. All he wanted in the world was to get home before his boy fell asleep waiting for him. He was cutting through the old rail platform on Union Street, a shortcut he'd used 100 times, when he saw her. A girl, no older than 8, sat wedged into the corner where the ticket booth met the brick wall, knees to her chest, a plastic grocery bag clutched like it held everything she owned, because it did. Her feet were bare and blue with cold. She watched the rain the way a person watches something they've stopped expecting to stop. Daniel didn't rush her. He'd raised enough scared animals and one scared little boy to know that a grown man moving fast toward a child in the dark was its own kind of violence. He stopped several feet away, crouched low so he wasn't looming, and asked her name in the same quiet voice he used to talk his son down from nightmares. "Nora," she said. Nothing else. He called the police from a payphone outside a shuttered diner and asked specifically for someone from child services, because he wanted every part of what came next to happen in daylight, with no shortcuts and nothing to hide. But he didn't leave her. He bought a cup of hot cocoa from an all-night bodega and a second-hand coat from a rack by the register, and he set both down beside her without a word, then stepped back to give her room. She didn't touch either one for a long time. She studied them the way you'd study a trap. Then she asked him the only question that mattered. "Are you going to come back?" Daniel went still. He knew that question in his bones, because he'd asked a version of it himself once, as a boy waiting on a porch for a father who never turned around. He understood, looking at this soaked, watchful child, that she wasn't asking about the next 10 minutes. She was asking whether anyone ever would choose to keep her. "I'm not going anywhere," he told her, and he didn't. What followed was 8 months of paperwork, home visits, and the particular exhaustion of proving to a system that a poor man's love was still love. Daniel filled out every form. He sat through every interview, and on a gray Tuesday in a county office that smelled like burnt coffee, Nora Brennan became Nora Reyes. He wasn't rich when he did it. He had nothing to gain and no one watching. He took her in because a child was cold, and to him that was never a math problem. It was just the answer. The day the papers were signed, he pressed the spare key to their apartment into her palm and folded her small fingers shut around it. "In this house," he told her, "nobody walks through a storm alone. Not ever again." That sentence became the load-bearing wall of everything that came after. Years move the way they do, faster than you're ready for. Daniel kept working the yard by day, and at the kitchen table under a cracked lamp by night, he started teaching himself freight. Not from books, from watching. He noticed what the executives never bothered to see. Trucks driving home empty after every delivery, refrigerated units sitting idle for days because nobody coordinated schedules, small operators losing contracts not because they were worse, but because they were invisible to the companies that mattered. Daniel had lived inside every one of those wasted hours, and slowly, stubbornly, he began to imagine a business that closed those gaps instead of profiting from them. From a rented garage with a roof that dripped in 3 places, he founded Reyes Freight Solutions with 2 used trucks and a routing spreadsheet that his son Ethan and his daughter Nora helped debug once they were old enough to type. What Daniel had that no competitor could buy was simple. He'd been every one of the people who worked for him. The drivers trusted him because he still drove routes himself when someone called in sick. The loading crews trusted him because he learned their names before he learned their job titles. Word moved through the industry the slow, unglamorous way that Reyes was a man who kept his word down to the hour. There were harder years too, the kind the story tends to skip past. Winter, when 2 of the 3 trucks broke down in the same week and Daniel slept 4 hours a night for a month fixing them himself rather than lay anyone off. A summer when a client backed out of a contract 2 days before a shipment was due, and Daniel drove the route himself through the night rather than let his reputation take the hit. Ethan remembered those years as a boy watching his father come home gray with exhaustion and still find the energy to check homework at the kitchen table. Nora remembered them as the years she learned that steadiness wasn't the absence of struggle. It was what struggle looked like when nobody quit. Nora grew up inside that world, and it shaped her into something sturdier than sentiment. She was never the fragile girl from the platform in anyone's memory of her. She was the teenager reading second-hand contract law textbooks in the corner of the garage while her father explained the fine print of a shipping agreement, and asking him with real anger in her voice why poor people always seemed to lose the moment they didn't understand the paperwork. Daniel didn't have a clean answer. He gave her the truest one he had. You might not always have money, he told her, but you never ever sign something you haven't read to the last word. That sentence planted a seed. Nora decided she'd become a lawyer, not to escape where she came from, but to make sure nobody else got robbed by a clause they didn't understand. When her first tuition bill came due, Daniel sold one of the company's original trucks to cover it, even though the business needed every dollar that year. Ethan, older now and long past thinking of Nora as anything but his sister, stood beside their father and said if Nora wanted this, the whole family would carry it. Over 18 years, Reyes Freight Solutions grew into Reyes Freight and Cold Chain, a logistics company worth just over $800 million, with refrigerated warehouses across 3 states and long-term contracts with 2 of the country's largest grocery chains. But the bigger it grew, the more strangers Daniel was forced to seat at his own boardroom table. And that, though he wouldn't understand it until it was almost too late, is where the danger started. In the present, Daniel Reyes was no longer a broke mechanic with a toolbox in his trunk. He was the founder of a company that fed a meaningful share of the eastern seaboard. And yet he still wore the same style of canvas work jacket, still laced steel-toed boots most mornings, still ate lunch on an overturned crate beside the loading dock rather than in the glass-walled executive suite 2 floors up. To the people who moved his freight, that made him a man worth following. To the board, it made him an embarrassment. Warren Blackwell, chairman of the board, had decided that a founder who ate lunch with forklift drivers had no business steering a company worth nearly $1 billion. He was smooth, patient, allergic to anything that couldn't be quantified. And he'd come to see Daniel's plainness not as integrity, but as a weakness with a price tag on it. Blackwell had joined the board 4 years earlier, brought in by outside investors during an expansion round, and in that time he had never once set foot on the loading dock. He measured the company in slide decks and quarterly ratios, and what he saw in those numbers wasn't a business built out of trust and kept promises. He saw an inefficiency waiting to be corrected. A founder who still signed off on driver bonuses personally, who still knew mechanics' kids by name, who treated the company less like an asset and more like a family that happened to move freight. Blackwell partnered quietly with Corin Ashby, CEO of Ashby Capital Partners, a private equity firm known for buying companies at their most vulnerable moment and stripping them for parts. Together they built a plan to force Daniel out at a fraction of what the company was worth, then sell it whole to Ashby Capital. Their method was patient and ugly. Blackwell manufactured a fraud claim built around an old federal contract, accusing Daniel of quietly diverting company funds into a private account for the benefit of Nora, his adopted daughter, no blood relation, an easy villain in a headline. The goal wasn't really to win in court. It was to freeze Daniel's voting control long enough to force a sale, and to make the kindest thing he'd ever done look like the crime that finally caught up with him. What blindsided Daniel was that the documents produced against him carried a signature that was, at a glance, indistinguishable from his own. A trust fund that had existed in Nora's name for over a decade was recast in the filing as a slush account. Proof, the complaint claimed, that Daniel had been bleeding the company to enrich the girl he'd taken off the street. The story leaked before he ever saw the courtroom, and the same press that once called him a self-made success now called him a fraud dressed up as a saint. Ethan wanted to fight it in the press immediately, to go on record and tear the accusation apart before it spread further. Daniel put a hand on his son's shoulder and asked him to wait. He'd survived worse than this. He believed, stubbornly, that the truth had its own current and would surface if he didn't panic it into hiding. But what actually cut him wasn't the threat to the company. He'd been broke before. He knew he could survive it again. What cut him was watching strangers turn the single most human thing he'd ever done, pulling a freezing child off a train platform, into a liability on a spreadsheet, a sentimental mistake, a soft spot that proved he'd never really been fit to run a serious company. On the last night before it began, a courier delivered a summons to his door. 72 hours until the hearing that would decide everything. When the crisis broke, everyone who loved Daniel went looking for Nora. She'd become a young attorney in D.C., specializing in exactly the kind of trust and corporate fraud law that now threatened her father, by any measure, the single most qualified person alive to defend him. And at the exact hour he needed her most, she didn't answer. Her office said she was traveling. Her apartment sat dark. Calls went to voicemail, texts went unread, and the silence stretched long enough to grow teeth. Had she chosen her career over her father? Had Ashby Capital gotten to her first? Was she hiding something of her own? Warren Blackwell fed that silence to reporters with practiced, sorrowful precision. Even his own daughter won't stand up for him, he said. Let the sentence do its work. Corin Ashby, in a lobby interview under marble lighting, said quietly that empires couldn't be run on charity, and that sentiment had finally caught up to a foolish old man. Daniel didn't blame Nora. alone in his study. He took out an old photograph. A soaked girl in a second-hand coat standing beside a young Ethan, smiling so faintly you had to already love her to see it. He told June Ferris, the office manager who'd stood by him for 15 years, that Nora owed him nothing. He hadn't taken her in expecting repayment. A child had been cold. No accounting had ever entered into it, and none was owed now. What no one in Portland knew was that Nora hadn't run from fear or betrayal. She was 3 states away, moving through the archived records of a defunct law firm, hunting for the original of a trust document that June had once been trusted to safeguard. In the middle of that search, she found something that changed the shape of the entire case. She had started, 3 days earlier, with nothing but a hunch and the memory of her father once mentioning, almost offhand, that there had been paperwork from before the paperwork. Documents drawn up back when the company was 2 trucks and a dream, before any lawyer with real prestige would have bothered taking his call. She'd tracked the original filing attorney's retirement, then his old firm's dissolution, then the storage company that had inherited 40 years of abandoned client files nobody had claimed. It took 2 days of cold calls and one uncomfortable conversation with a records clerk who didn't want to let a stranger into a sealed archive before she finally stood in front of the right shelf. The fund in her name wasn't money her father had quietly diverted. It was a founder's protective trust, established years before the company ever grew large enough to attract predators, built for exactly the purpose of shielding the company's founding principles from men like the ones now circling it. Late on the second night, in a records vault that smelled like dust and old paper, she found the sealed archival box she'd been searching for. Across the front, in her father's careful handwriting, were words she read 3 times before she trusted them. For Nora Reyes, open it when the court finally asks who the promise belongs to. She sat down on the cold floor with the box in her lap, and for the first time in 18 years, the frightened girl from the platform and the sharp young attorney became, fully, the same person. The hearing convened in federal commercial court on a flat gray morning. Daniel sat at the defense table beside a court-appointed attorney who had inherited a case 3 days before trial and clearly hadn't slept since. Across the aisle, Blackwell commanded a row of expensive lawyers led by Gideon Cross, a litigator famous for strangling opponents with the fine print of their own contracts. Judge Helena Marsh presided, famously immune to money, famously impatient with theater. Cross opened like a man holding a winning hand. He put the wire transfers on the courtroom screen, then the trust documents, then Daniel's signature blown up until it filled the wall, and finally, deliberately, the adoption papers. He painted the picture for the jury box. A sentimental single father, blinded by affection, quietly funneling company money to the girl he'd taken off the street. He turned to Daniel directly and asked, in front of a packed gallery, whether he had adopted a girl named Nora Reyes. "I did," Daniel said. "Whether he had established a fund in her name." "I did." A murmur rolled through the room. Within minutes, the story was already moving across every wire. Founder confesses to diverting company assets to adopted daughter. Blackwell allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Corin Ashby sat in the back gallery with the stillness of a woman who already knew how the book ended. Daniel's borrowed attorney rose to argue the trust was lawful, legitimate, properly established. But without the original documents in hand, the argument had no floor under it, and the judge's face didn't move. The room had tilted hard against the defense, and the machine of the law was grinding, slowly and precisely, toward freezing Daniel out of his own company. Judge Marsh looked up from her notes and asked if the defense had any further witnesses. Silence. The heavy doors at the back stayed shut. Then, just as the judge lifted her pen to sign the preliminary order, the doors opened. A young woman in a dark plain suit walked in with a leather portfolio under her arm. She didn't hurry. She didn't apologize for the interruption. She walked straight to the clerk's table and said in a clear, even voice, "Nora Reyes, counsel of record for the defense, moved to submit emergency evidence." The room went silent. Daniel turned in his chair, and for one suspended second he didn't see an attorney at all. He saw an 8-year-old on a train platform, asking if anyone was coming back. Nora didn't let that gaze move her. She stood straight, chin level, and waited for the court the way any officer of the law would wait. Gideon Cross was on his feet immediately, objecting that Nora Reyes had an obvious conflict of interest as the defendant's adopted daughter. Nora answered without heat, since the plaintiffs had made her identity and her adoption the centerpiece of their own accusation. She had every right to appear both as a witness to the truth and as counsel on the terms of the trust itself. It was clean logic, and it turned Cross's own strategy back on him. Judge Marsh, after a long look at both tables, allowed her a preliminary statement. Nora opened the portfolio and laid the original Reyes founder's trust on the table, a document created years before the company was worth mentioning. She walked the court through its language, and that language proved the opposite of everything the plaintiffs had built their case on. Daniel hadn't moved company assets into his daughter's hands. He'd placed a portion of his own founding shares into a protective trust for one purpose: to stop the board from ever selling the company against the principles it was built on. The fund wasn't a theft. It was a wall. That was the first reversal, and it landed hard. Nora wasn't the secret beneficiary of stolen money. She was the named guardian of the founding shares, the one person Daniel had chosen years earlier to protect the company if he was ever driven out of it by fraud. She turned toward Blackwell and spoke without raising her voice. The question was never what my father took out of this company. The question is who's been trying to sell what was never theirs to sell. Next, she produced a letter, handwritten by Daniel the day her adoption was finalized. Gideon Cross scoffed that a sentimental family letter carried no legal weight. Nora was ready for exactly that. She showed the court that the letter hadn't sat in a drawer. It had been formally attached to the trust as a statement of founder's intent, incorporated by reference, and it therefore carried the legal force of the document that contained it. She read from it. In the letter, Daniel had written that he'd lost his own family once and wouldn't stand by while anyone was left behind for lacking money or a name. He hadn't built the trust to make Nora wealthy. He'd built it to protect the company from men who would one day try to turn it into a machine for their own profit. And then a line that reached across 18 years and landed directly in that courtroom. If the board ever used Nora's past as a weapon against the family, that act alone would prove they'd betrayed the founding spirit of the company, and the trust protections would activate the moment that betrayal occurred. The silence in the room changed texture. This wasn't sentiment anymore. It was a trap closing, and no one yet knew who was standing inside it. The letter connected to a specific clause buried in the trust. If the board ever tried to sell controlling shares by manufacturing a false accusation against the founder, reserve voting authority would pass to the trust's named protector. The protector, named years earlier, was Nora Reyes, effective once she came of age and held a license to practice law. Cross objected that the clause had long since lapsed. Nora produced the annual renewal filings, submitted precisely on schedule every year by June Ferris. June took the stand and confirmed under oath that Daniel had always reported the trust in full and filed every renewal without fail. Then she confirmed the thing that turned the gallery cold. Blackwell had personally kept those renewal filings out of the rest of the board's hands, burying the exact paperwork that would have proven the trust was legitimate, so that when his manufactured lawsuit arrived, no director would remember Daniel had done everything in the open. Across the aisle, Corinne Ashby's composure finally cracked at the edges. She understood, before anyone else in the room, that if this clause held, her acquisition was already dead. Nora stopped defending and started attacking. She entered a chain of internal messages between Blackwell and Ashby, and in them the two conspirators wrote with the careless cruelty of people who never expected to be read aloud. Blackwell had agreed to apply legal pressure to drive the company's price down before Ashby's formal offer came in. They'd called Daniel the mechanic with the sentimental blind spot. They'd called Nora the emotional card we flip into a financial accusation. Cross argued the messages had been spliced together out of context. Nora was ready for that too. She entered the metadata, the digital signatures, and a certified independent forensic report. She'd built her case in overlapping layers precisely because she knew they'd fight every inch. Then the blow beneath the blow. The payment routed from a shell entity tied to Ashby Capital into a personal consulting account belonging to Warren Blackwell, dated the exact same day he filed his lawsuit against Daniel. No judge alive could call that a coincidence. Judge Marsh turned to Blackwell and asked him, flatly, to explain the payment. For the first time all morning, his composure failed him. He had no answer that didn't convict him. The final piece was worse. Nora produced minutes from a private meeting in which Blackwell had promised Ashby that once Daniel's voting rights were frozen, the board would sell 51% of the company at 40% below its real value. It wasn't just theft from Daniel. It was a plan to gut every shareholder and hand thousands of working families to a buyer who intended to strip the company for parts. Judge Marsh's expression shifted visibly. She ordered an immediate halt to any transaction involving Ashby Capital until the full record could be reviewed. Nora faced the gallery. They called my father a man ruled by family sentiment. It was they who planned to sell thousands of working families into silence for a quiet profit. She directed her counsel to pivot the questioning squarely onto Nora's identity, hoping to shake her credibility in front of the court. It was calculated and cruel, and everyone in the room felt the temperature drop. Gideon Cross walked Nora back through her own history, the nights she'd spent unsheltered, the fact that she'd never known her birth family, the tuition Daniel had paid for law school. The point was obvious. Paint her as a woman too indebted to be objective, witness testifying to protect the man who owned her loyalty. Nora didn't crack. She let the silence work for her instead of against her. She admitted all of it, plainly, without shame. Daniel had given her a home, a name, an education, a life. She would never pretend otherwise. Then she turned the confession into her sharpest argument. She said that because he'd given her those things, she understood better than anyone in that room the difference between a debt and a promise. A debt is something you pay off to be free of it. A promise is something you keep because of who you've decided to be. She hadn't come to that courtroom to repay a debt with emotion. She'd come because the documents in her hand proved the truth, and the truth didn't need gratitude to make it real. And then she played the recording no one had seen coming. Before the hearing, Ashby had reached out to her through an intermediary, a partnership offer at a major New York firm, along with a significant payment, on one condition: that Nora simply not show up. Nora had recorded the entire conversation lawfully, under full compliance with the recording statute of the state where it took place, because the instinct her father had taught her told her to protect the truth before she ever tried to use it. The recording played. The intermediary's voice was unmistakable. Ashby Capital doesn't need you to betray your father. We just need you to stay quiet. That did more damage than any document. It exposed the real shape of the plot. They'd never needed Nora's betrayal. They'd only needed her absence. Silence itself had been the weapon. And now it was broken open in front of the whole court. Daniel looked at her with an expression that held both fierce pride and a father's aching guilt. He understood now what those silent days had actually cost her. The weight she'd carried alone, walking directly behind an enemy to gather the final proof, without a word to the man she was protecting. Judge Marsh entered the recording into the record and issued a formal warning to the plaintiffs regarding witness interference. The case had fully and finally tilted. With the record laid bare, Nora returned to the trust's central clause and read it aloud slowly so no one could later claim confusion. If the founder was ever attacked through a financial accusation tied to his family, that accusation was proven to have been manufactured to force a hostile sale. Founding voting authority would pass temporarily to the trust's named protector, Nora Reyes, effective the moment she held a license to practice law. The meaning moved through the room like a pressure change. Using Nora to try to destroy Daniel, Blackwell had unknowingly triggered the exact legal mechanism that put the power in her hands instead. The weapon they'd built out of her past had turned and become the shield that saved everything. Nora moved the court to recognize her temporary voting authority, freeze the Ashby acquisition entirely, suspend Blackwell from the board, and allow Daniel to keep running the company he founded through the remainder of the investigation. Gideon Cross objected with everything he had left, but there was no ground left under him and everyone could hear it. Judge Marsh reviewed the documents, compared the signatures line by line, confirmed the filing dates, and issued the emergency order. Daniel's authority would not be frozen. The sale was suspended immediately. Blackwell was removed from every decision touching the company. Nora Reyes was formally recognized as protector of the founding voting authority for the length of the investigation. Corin Ashby rose to leave. Judge Marsh ordered her to stay. She might yet be implicated in the manipulation of evidence and the interference with a witness. Daniel bowed his head, not from weakness, but because the empire he'd built had just been saved by the very child who'd once asked him, on a rainy platform, whether he'd ever come back. Outside, in the marble corridor, Daniel and Nora found each other, and there was no performance in it because they'd both survived too much for that. "I thought you'd gone," Daniel said finally. "I learned it from you," Nora answered steady. "When someone builds a trap in front of the door, you find the way in from the back." He apologized for letting her past be dragged through open court, picked over like line items on a ledger. She told him it wasn't his fault. People like Blackwell and Ashby always assumed a person's hard beginnings were something that could be used to shame them. For Nora, her beginnings meant something else entirely, proof that she understood, better than either of her polished opponents ever would, the real value of a roof, a signature, and a promise kept. Ethan appeared at the end of the hall and pulled his sister into a rough hug, telling her he'd always known she'd come through. For a moment the small family just stood there, whole, without needing to say anything else. "Why didn't you tell me the plan?" Daniel asked. "Why let me sit through those days thinking I was alone?" "Because if you'd known," Nora said, "you'd have spent every ounce of yourself trying to protect me instead, and you might have tipped them off before I was ready. This time I wanted to be the one doing the protecting." There, in that plain hallway, the whole shape of the story settled into place. 18 years earlier, Daniel had walked into Nora's life at the exact moment she had no one left. 18 years later, she'd walked into a courtroom at the exact moment he was about to lose everything. "I didn't adopt you so you'd save me one day," Daniel said, his voice rough. "I know," Nora said. "You just taught me never to let family stand alone in the rain." In the weeks that followed, Reyes Freighted Cold Chain rebuilt its board from the ground up. Warren Blackwell faced a formal investigation for fraud, evidence tampering, and accepting payment from a firm tied to the very acquisition he'd engineered, and the reputation he'd spent decades polishing came apart in days. Corin Ashby lost the deal and found herself the subject of a financial inquiry that would trail her for years. Gideon Cross quietly withdrew from the case, which, in its own way, was the most honest thing he'd done in the whole affair. Daniel came back to run the company, but not alone this time, because he'd learned exactly what isolation could cost a man. He put Ethan in charge of operations, the work his son had always loved. He asked June Ferris to oversee the transparency of every filing so nothing would ever be buried in the dark again. And he asked Nora to serve as permanent counsel to the founder's trust, not as a family gesture, but because she'd proven she was the one person willing to defend the company from anyone who tried to use a contract to break a promise. She accepted on one condition, that she'd answer to the document, and to the truth, and to nothing else. Daniel called the whole company together on the same loading dock where he'd once worked as a young mechanic with grease under his nails. He told them the short version of a rainy night years back, Not to show off his own kindness, he made that clear, but to remind every person standing there what the company had actually been built on. The rule that no one gets left behind for lacking money or power or the right last name. Nora stood beside him while he spoke. No longer the barefoot child from the platform, but the woman who'd used the law itself to protect her family, and the thousands of families whose paychecks depended on it. On an ordinary morning not long after, with the water bright and the gulls loud over the yard, Nora came to stand beside her father and press something small and cold into his palm. The old apartment key. The one he'd folded into her hand when she was 8 years old and had nowhere else to go. She'd kept it for 18 years. "You gave me a key when I didn't have a home," she said. "Today I'm just giving you back the key to the one you built." Daniel turned it over in his fingers, then slid it into the pocket of the same worn canvas jacket he'd worn through every season of his life, from the docks to the boardroom and back again. The company was safe. But more than that, the promise he'd made under a dripping platform awning all those years ago, that in his house, nobody walks through a storm alone, stood exactly as whole as the day he first said it.